output is just kind of summing that all together to give you, for example, total harvest across the whole region or at a state level. I think with that, I'll move to the next slide, which is just an illustration of how that works. This is similar information, just kind of visually illustrating it a little differently. So you can see how it works in a step-by-step manner with taking the biological inputs, the economic inputs, the simulation model, and then the, oh, sorry, my slides are not. Stephen, I might switch to having you move the slides so I'm staying on track, if that's okay. This is getting ahead of itself. Thanks. Okay, so the little circles at the bottom are the outputs of the model. So you can see that it's outputting landings and discards, as well as measures of fishing efforts, so numbers of trips that would be taken, and angler welfare. So some of this is information that we haven't necessarily had available to us in the past when considering the impacts of our measures on all these sorts of things. Next slide. So next I'll cover a high-level overview of the Recreational Fleet Dynamics Model, or RFDM. Can you go back one, Stephen? Thanks. So this model similarly aims to predict the responses to regulation changes in recreational harvest and discards. It does it in a little bit of a different way, and it's just predicting harvest and discards. It doesn't have the same outputs in terms of the economic outputs or effort or angler satisfaction. So this model uses available data, including MRIP harvest and discard estimates, as well as a time series of regulations that have been in place in the past across all the states. And it also uses a few stock status variables like spawning stock biomass and recruitment that were pulled from the stock assessments for each species. So this information is used to predict total harvest and total discards in numbers of fish, and it includes measures of uncertainty in those estimates. And the information can be broken down to the state and wave level. And for Scup, it can also be broken down into the private and for-hire modes. So of all the models for all three species, only this model, only for Scup, can currently make predictions at the mode level. Both models could be updated in the future to do separate predictions by mode for all three species, but right now it's only set up for to do it separately for mode for Scup for the RFDM. And then we do know that some states do have separate measures by mode for some species. So in the cases where that was not addressed in the model directly, the modelers made assumptions about how to treat that. And we can answer questions about that if you have it. So also wanted to note that the folks who worked on this model tested multiple model configurations and combinations of variables to determine the best model for each species. And for that reason, the exact parameters of the individual models for each species for harvest and discards, they're not the exact same across all species, because they determined which combination fit best for each species. Next slide. So this gives you a better idea of the specific data that goes into the RFDM. It includes data through 2021. However, 2022 data were excluded from this model, given that that was an unconventional year with the MRIP data due to the pandemic and the suspension of the shoreside intercept sampling for much of the year, and the imputations that ultimately went into the data that we used for 2020. So there was a decision made to just leave 2020 out of this model, but it includes a time series for each species through 2021. And the little table at the bottom there shows you an example of the data frame that's going into it. And this is showing an example for Scup. So you can see it includes regulatory variables such as the wave, the bag in place for that wave, the season length, the number, meaning the number of days open in that wave, and then a minimum size. And as I previously mentioned, there's a mode variable in there only for Scup. And then also there's, again, those stock status and management variables like the RHL, spawning stock biomass, and recruitment. Next slide. This is an example of the specific variables that are going into the model for Scup. You can also see that this model is modeling harvest and discards separately. And you can see that the variables that are going in there, they vary slightly. And again, that was based on decisions about which combinations seem to best fit the data. Next slide. So one of the discussions for today, which we'll get into, our intention is to kind of get into more of the details about these decisions for the species-specific presentations that will follow this agenda item, but just kind of to set this stage, we did have the monitoring committee talk about both models, and the monitoring committee did provide recommendations for a preferred model for setting 2023 measures for each species, and they did not recommend one model to be used across the board. They recommended, one model for summer flounder and then the other model for the other two species. And the recommendations were based on the capabilities of the model, some species-specific considerations, and model performance. So the monitoring committee reviewed an analysis of out-of-sample predictions and a retrospective analysis, which was basically a way of looking at how well did the model predict past MRIP data. And that, there were some variations in that across the models and across the species. So those are the sorts of things that the monitoring committee considered when making their recommendations, and we'll describe those in more detail for each of the species-specific presentations that follow this one. But also of note was that just last week we got a letter from Garfo regarding the use of these models, and the letter stated that ultimately Garfo makes the decision on what's the best available science when approving management measures. So Garfo has to, in approving measures, has to determine that those measures are based on the best available science. And the letter also said that Garfo considers the recreational demand model, or RDM, to be the best available science for setting 2023 measures for all three species. So this differs from the monitoring committee recommendation because the monitoring committee recommended the other model for some of the species, not, they didn't have a across the board recommendation for all three species. So the rationale provided in the letter for why the RDM was preferred by Garfo is that it incorporates data on angler behavior, and it has narrower confidence intervals than the other model. And as Tracy summarized, the confidence intervals are part of the first step of the percent change approach in determining your outcome for setting measures. Next slide. And just to kind of set the stage for some of the discussions that will happen later and kind of why we have a lot of different pieces of information to consider today, we wanted to kind of lay out the timeline of some things that happened over the past month or so, because we do have multiple models to start with, and we have multiple versions of the models. So just to kind of lay out the timeline to help you hopefully kind of keep this straight, but starting in October, we had the letter from Garfo about the accountability measures saying that no additional action is needed to address the triggering of accountability measures for scup and black sea bass. That was considered during a monitoring committee meeting at the end of October, when the monitoring committee talked about the overall process that we will use, and they reviewed the two models, and they provided some feedback to the modelers, and just had some kind of overall discussions before a second monitoring committee meeting on November 15th, where they made their final recommendations in terms of the preferred model for 2023 for each species, the resulting percent change, and some other specific recommendations for measures that they needed to use, that they needed to make. So again, they recommended the RDM for summer flounder and the RFDM for scup and black sea bass. After that, we took all that information to the advisory panel on November 30th, and advisors provided their own input, which we'll summarize all this in the species-specific presentations. And then again, I guess we haven't said this part yet, but I think this was last Monday, December 6th, the council staff got a letter from the modeler of the RDM with updated results. And there were changes made to the model after the monitoring committee meeting. And the changes were not changes that were requested by staff or by the monitoring committee, but the modeler made changes in an attempt to improve the fit of the model, and just make, they were thought of as just improvements to the model, but these were not anticipated by staff or the monitoring committee. So the monitoring committee did not review the revisions, and they weren't available at the time of the monitoring committee meeting. And it did change the outcome for summer flounder, which we'll describe in more detail in the presentation for that species later today. But at the monitoring committee meeting, the results were suggesting a 10% liberalization was appropriate, and then the revisions put us in the 10% reduction category. And then again, we got this letter from Garfo on December 8th saying that their stance is that the recreational demand model is the best available science and should be used for all 3 species for 2023. So these last 2 bullets, were not things that were discussed by the advisors or the monitoring committee and required, if this is the way that the decision is to go today, to use the latest model run of the RDM for all 3 species, that required some tweaks to the recommendations of the monitoring committee. And we, again, will describe in more detail how that might play out for each of the 3 species, but just wanted to set the stage for those discussions right now and hopefully hold off on the more detailed discussions to the individual species presentations. And next slide. This is the last slide, just outlining next steps. So today, when we walk through each of the presentations for each species, the goal is for the council and board to determine the required coastwide percent change in harvest for each species following the percent change approach. And then the council and board also need today to recommend federal waters measures for Scup, and then the conservation equivalency measures for summer flounder and black sea bass. So those are the non-preferred coastwide and precautionary default measures. So those are decisions that need to be made today. And then after this meeting, then there'll be the technical committee and board process to determine the state waters measures. So there's 2 technical committee meetings scheduled for January to develop guidance for how the states should go about developing their measures. And then after that, the states will develop proposals for state waters measures. And then later the board will review and consider approval of those state waters measures. So some continued discussions will happen after today about how the state waters measures will be developed, fitting within whatever the overall percent reduction or liberalization is decided today. And then later in the spring, then there'll be there still needs to be the rulemaking process on the federal side of things. So the final rule usually happens around March or later to implement the federal waters measures for Scup. And then if there's a recommendation to waive the federal waters measures for summer flounder and black sea bass, if that's approved, that will be effective around this time frame. So just wanted to lay that all out. And then that's the last slide, and we can open it up for questions and discussions, but just wanted to again remind everyone that we'll get into a lot of the details in the species specific presentations later today. So maybe kind of keep that in mind when thinking about the discussion right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Tracy, for your very informative presentation. I just want to make note that we're a little bit over our time on the agenda. And as Julia just mentioned, a lot of this is going to come up through the species discussions. But if anyone has any specific questions regarding the presentation for the background information on the models and timeline and things like that, I would entertain that now. I have Dewey Hemmelwright first. Dewey?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for your presentation. Could you go to slide 11, please? And my question here is, given this new methodology of a harvest control rule and these different models, what are going to be the accountability measures, and how will you track overages? And it appears to me, well, not appears to me, but in reading of the stuff, there will be no target that's set out beforehand. The target is based on the biomass of the stock or things like that. So it's like we got 2 differentials between the commercial and the new methodology of doing something, to where you're given a annual catch limit and you're held to that annual catch limit. And on the other side, we're going to base it on the biomass of the stock that could be floating in different things and different models of angler participation or something like that. But how do you, is there going to be any accountability measures for the recreational industry, and what triggers that? Thank you.
I'll take that one. So you're right that with the percent change approach, it does kind of set up a different structure for the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery. So it used to be that the commercial fishery is held to the commercial, it's still this way. The commercial fishery is held to the commercial quota. And if the quota is reached before the end of the year, the fishery can be shut down in season. And if there's overages of the commercial quota based on landings, the commercial fishery pays those back. If there's an ACL overage. So that's still the case. And it used to be that the recreational fishery, we tried to set measures to constrain the recreational fishery to the RHL. So it's similar in intent, where both sectors, the aim was to constrain them to their landings limit, the quota or the RHL. But with the percent change approach, the target is no longer the RHL, and the target varies based on those considerations that you said on that big table. So it takes into account the RHL and biomass and the confidence intervals. So we'll still have a target level of harvest, but it's not the RHL anymore. Like, for example, for black sea bass, if we need a 10% reduction in what we would otherwise expect harvest to be, that's the new target, is that 10% reduction, which in this case is higher than the RHL. So in this case, it is allowing RHL overages, but we do still have accountability measures, so that you're allowing, in this specific example, you're allowing an RHL overage, but if that results in an ACL overage, it still triggers an accountability measure. But for stocks that are above their biomass target, it doesn't say that you need to pay that back. It just says you need to adjust measures. And then in this specific case, we have the advice from Garfo saying that given changes that were made recently, that AM has been satisfied. So it's a little, it's not as straightforward as it was before. But you're right, we do still have a target level of harvest, but it's not the RHL anymore. And we do still have accountability measures that are still triggered based on that same 3-year average of the recreational ACL for the recreational fishery. And that's the same as it was before.
Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, a follow-up. So the accountability measures will only go into effect if the stock is overfished or overfish is occurring?
If you mean accountability measures in terms of like paybacks of overages, that is only happening if the stock is below the target level.
But for the commercial side, we don't have that opportunity for that to happen, given the management of the fishery and the reporting, and when the quota's caught, the fishery is stopped. So there's two different avenues of what's going on here. One, you pay it back, and the other, there's different thresholds before you might pay it back, or you'll have different management changes into the future. Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
Yes. On the commercial side, if the overages was due to discards, then there's consideration of stock status. But if there's an overage based on landings, the commercial sector always pays that back.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dewey. Next, I have Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So two questions. The first is, was there ever a plan for the SSC to re-review the models once improvements were made? Was that ever part of the work plan or conversation?
We discussed it, but we decided not to do that.
And then I guess, the other thing I have is, it's really more of a process issue, and I guess it's more of a comment than it is a question, but I'm looking at the regional BSIA framework for the Northeast, which, sort of lays out the responsibilities of best scientific information, available determination, and who has what responsibility with respect to assessments and catch specifications. And so, within that, it states that for catch specifications, no fisheries will inform the council if there are concerns with the catch specifications, during development. And so, given that the monitoring committee did discuss both of these models, October 26th, I think was the first meeting. And it was clear that there was going to be a decision that had to be made. I'm concerned about the timing of when, when the memo came out that we all just received last week with the, the joint BSIA determination between, Garfo and the Science Center. And, absolutely understand, respect that the agency has that responsibility. I just think that, given that this occurred after the monitoring committee's meeting, and after the advisory panel met, that concerns me because, we have a different outcome now. I'm not saying that, that outcome on summer flounder, aligns more with the perspectives of the advisory panel members that I have spoken to, but it's just that this is coming after the fact. And I think, AP members might feel a little bit disenfranchised, and it's not a great look for the council, since I think, the general public sees us as sort of that decision maker. It's a much broader viewpoint. So I just wanted to raise that concern. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and go to our next member of the board, Jason McNamee.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I really appreciate the kind of lead in that I just got there from Dr. Duval. And I'm going to apologize to you, Mr. Chair. This is a bit of a rant, not a question. And I hope you'll give me the space. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I'm going to start by saying I was pretty upset on Thursday when I received that letter from Garfo. And I want to preface everything I'm about to say by saying I really don't have a problem with the decision that was kind of outlined in that letter. I think Lou's model, the RDM model, I think it's fantastic. And these were the things I used to dream about as a monitoring committee member and a technical committee member for years and years. So my issue has nothing to do with the substance of that letter, but I do have an issue, and my issue is that the peer review that they sort of based their letter off of, just so it doesn't slip by folks, that happened in September of 2021. We're in December of 2022. So that peer review happened over a year ago. From that time, as Julia mentioned during the presentation, the state of Rhode Island has invested an enormous amount of time in taking those peer review results and working on the RFDM model, meeting after meeting with Corinne Truesdale on the DEM staff. We were meeting routinely, weekly, to make these improvements, to work through the improvements that we were making. And not only is it the state of Rhode Island, but you had Julia Beatty from the Mid-Atlantic was in, I can't even count for you the number of meetings that she was involved in. Dustin Colson-Leaning from the commission, more recently, Tracy Bauer worked with us to kind of work through these things, figure out how we were going to fit all of this stuff together. And then you have we kind of looked at the most recent period of time here, but the monitoring committee, the technical committee, the FMAT, these groups all looked at this stuff multiple times over that year. And so for that last year, all of these folks could have been looking at one model instead of two. They could have been focused on that model, perfecting that model without spending time reading reports for two models and trying to think through what was a more complicated situation. And so I'm just going to cut to the chase and say that Garfo and the Science Center, you've wasted an enormous amount of all of our time by dropping this on us a year and 2 months after the thing happened that you were supposedly basing your decision on. So I'm left to wonder why that timing is now. And I can only come up with two reasons. Either there's just a significant and exceptional lack of consideration of all of that work, even though both Garfo and the Science Center have people involved in these committees that I just rattled through. Or, I've listened over the years to staff from Garfo, staff from the Science Center kind of wring their hands about, oh, we can't give them multiple models because these silly managers, they're just going to pick the one with the better answer. Is that what you just did? Is that why the timing is now? I'll wrap it up there, Mr. Chair. I personally hope it's the first reason that I outlined and not the second. But I think it's pretty, I hope it's pretty obvious. I was really upset by that letter, and I'll leave it there. Thanks for the time, Mr. Chair.
No, I appreciate your thoughts, Jason, and your rant, I guess, if that's what it was. I wouldn't say that it was a rant, but I appreciate your thoughts. I am going to take, we have 4 hands at this point for members of the board and the council. I'm going to take those 4 hands and I'm going to limit it to that before we move on. There will be plenty of time throughout the day today to discuss things further as we get into the species discussions. So I have Rick Bellavance, Nicola Meserve, Adam Nowalski, and Tony Kearns. So I'll start with Rick. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ladies, for your presentation. You did a really good job. This is new to us, and well, not new, but it's new first time using it. And I thought the way you displayed it was really helpful and easy to follow. I do have a question, and I'm not sure if it's for you or the modelers that are on the phone or in the room about the concept of mode splits and separate measures by mode, looking towards the timing of 2023. Do you see that we'll be able to use these models to craft those types of measures for the different states that do use those currently, or is that not going to be available for the measure setting process for 2023? And I have a follow-up.
I can take that real quick. We've been discussing how that might be possible. That would occur during discussions of the TC of how exactly we would do it. But we're definitely thinking about, with the models, we could still possibly figure out how to do it, mode splits.
Okay, thanks. That's great to hear. And is there anything specifically that you would need from the board or the council here today to task you with anything in particular, or is just being on the record here good enough to let that happen?
Yeah, we won't need anything today, I think. Yeah, the TC will be able to handle all those.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start by thanking Jason and the Rhode Island team and also the Science Center for the effort that they put into these models for this year, and agree that I hope the work that they put in the last year since the peer review is not being overlooked. But one question about them that I had is, what are the potential implications for the 2022 data not being included in the model work? Everyone, of course, remembers that we took significant cuts in Scup and black sea bass this year. And so 2022 harvest data, while partial year, are still the only data that reflect those measures that were implemented this year. So I'm wondering if they're, how big a source of uncertainty that is, or is there a potential that, we're not getting credit potentially for harvest that was reduced this year by not including 2022 in the models? Thanks.
Julia?
I'll give a brief answer, and then if any of the modelers want to chime in with more details, that might be helpful. But just my initial response would be that my understanding is that neither model incorporates the preliminary 2022 data, but that they are, modeling as a starting point. Like if these measures, that's the starting point for the percent change approach. If the 2022 measures stayed in place, what are the models predicting for 2023 harvest? So the measures are in there, but the preliminary MRIP data for 2022, my understanding is that it's not in there, and that the modelers can correct me if I'm wrong. And then in terms of implications of that, of not including that preliminary data, I might leave that question to the modelers if any of them want to answer that. And Lou Carr-Harris is one of the modelers, and I can see that he raised his hand.
Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Yeah, just to address that. So in the model, the current formulation of the model, I use preliminary 2022 data in terms of catch per trip. That data is averages out, catch per trip over the past.
Yeah, we're having a hard time hearing you, Lou. I don't know if you're connected to your computer or a phone, but I didn't understand your response. I don't think anyone in the room did. If you could speak up a little bit, maybe, and try to do that again, that would be helpful.
Can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just switched my audio. So one more time, is everyone able to hear me?
We can hear you, but it doesn't sound like you can hear us, but go.
Okay, now I hear you. Sorry about that. Okay, so yes, the answer is yes. I do use preliminary 2022 catch per trip data, but that is augmented with catch per trip data from the last 5 years or the 4 years before that. So 2022 data is in there, and that's used to project what catch per trip will be in 2023.
Okay, thanks, Lou. Okay, a couple more hands. Adam Nowalski is next. Go ahead, Adam.
Thank you very much. So just going back to the very first slide of this presentation, we started out with the percent change approach to be replaced by 2026. I just want to confirm that while we do have the provision in place that would sunset the percent change approach, that would not preclude us from essentially renewing the percent change approach. It doesn't have to be replaced, but it would need some affirmative action by us if we want to keep using it at that point. That's the first question.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So the second point is, with the discussion we've had here about the process that we've gone through about model selection, either for all species or on a species by species basis, with regards to change in model inputs that may be considered. And I'll note that it's my belief that the model inputs that were changed for the most recent run of the RDMs were not based on some computational error. It was based on we think this may be better, although it was never reviewed, is my understanding. As well as we've got a process in place that has asked the monitoring committee and the AP to review in the past recommended liberalizations or reductions, whereas now maybe we need to consider retasking them with looking at these model inputs and making a determination. So in determining what model to use for which species, determining which are the best inputs, thinking about how we best incorporate our monitoring committee and TC for reviewing this, what is the right point in time for having that discussion about when to change that process that we undertake during 2023 or years beyond that?
Julia, do you have any thoughts on how that could work?
I mean, I think these are important. It would be super helpful to have this more clearly laid out, and we don't have to go through this struggle every year, and that we're definitely hoping that it can be more efficient in the future, but we haven't really squared away the exact details of like how that, decisions are made, and like necessarily like what level of decisions need to happen at the council and board meetings to, make those sort of changes to the process. So I think that's not really the best answer, but I think there's a general agreement that we could improve the process and make it more efficient, but haven't really squared away exactly, how to the timelines of that. And I think we're definitely hoping we're not in the same position again next year, but I feel like I'm kind of rambling, not really sure how to answer the question of like how those decisions are made to improve the process, but like I think that would be the goal overall. I don't know, Tracy, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add other than we're looking at how things are going this year, and we'll review it, discuss internally of how to make the process more efficient next year.
Go ahead, Adam.
So I'll appreciate that comment, and I'll just leave it then with council leadership and commission leadership to say that needs to be a priority in the not too distant future, so we're not left with all these questions and reversals this time next year. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Okay, I've got two more hands. I'm going to go to Tony Kearns and then Dr. Hare, and then we're going to conclude this item on today's agenda. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to sort of add on to Jason's rant a little bit, but this body, both of these bodies have discussed the recreational harvest control rule for so many meetings. We had these peer reviews presented to us. We approved the document, and every single time we talked about both of these models moving forward and working on them and using them. And at no point in time did the Science Center or Garfo say, hey, one of these models is better, do not continue moving on with these. And we did use a ton of staff time to continue developing both of these models. And I just don't understand how it is that we got to 3 days before this meeting and then we're told that we can only use one of these models. And so I'm just curious why we weren't told to stop moving forward with one of them if this was going to be the indication from the Science Center.
I appreciate that, Tony. I'm going to turn next to our Science Center Director, Dr. Hare.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And first, thank you, Dr. MAFMC, for just discussing your perspective and being honest and constructive about it. And thank you to Tony for discussing your perspective. I don't have an answer for you as to how we got to this point to make to sort of clearly articulate our position on the two models at this point in time. But I do think it's worth a small group conversation to sort of map back through starting in September 2021 and looking till now, and then find out and think about how we could do better. What particularly resonates with me is the waste of time. Resources are limited, and we should make sure that we're making our decisions and our processes are making most effective use of the resources that we have. So it's clear that resources and efforts did not go to the best end in this case. And so I think we need to talk about and figure out where we could have done better. And I don't know, Mr. Moore, Executive Director, how you want to do that. But Science Center is willing to have that conversation with Mr. Beal.
Yeah, there's no response at this point, but we can have that conversation offline. I appreciate your comments, John. I'm going to go, since we're well over our allotted time limit for this item on the agenda. I'm going to go ahead and close this item for discussion at this point. I think we heard a lot of good comments. It was a good background summary for the discussions that we're going to have over the course of today. I'd like to take, and I mean 5 minutes this time. We're going to do a 5-minute kind of stretch your legs break, and we'll come back at we'll come back in 5 minutes. 10:10. Thanks. All right, this is everybody's 1 minute notice. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, welcome back to the table, everyone. I'd like to get things kicked off today. We had a good discussion this morning, and now we need to step through the species-specific recreational measures. We're going to start with our 2023 Scup rec measures discussion. Our lead presenter will be Hannah Hart with the council staff, and we also have Tracy with the commission here, and Kylie Dancy also with council staff sitting at the back end of the table. So I'm going to go ahead and throw things over to Hannah to get things kicked off.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. So as indicated this morning, first up is 2023 recreational measures for Scup. Stephen, you may have to advance this. Okay. So here's a condensed version of the timeline Julia provided towards the end of the previous presentation. So I won't go into great detail here, but just as a reminder, there's been a lot of developments over the past month and a half, and these are some things to keep in mind as we move through the Scup presentation this morning. So the overall objectives for today is to go over recent recreational fishery performance, review the monitoring committee recommendations for 2023 Scup recreational measures, as well as input provided by the AP. We will also need to discuss and identify the appropriate model to be used for setting 2023 measures and the resulting percent change needed under the percent change approach, and identify any federal water measures to achieve the resulting percent change if that is required. So this slide is a quick reminder of the current recreational measures in federal waters. Currently, there is a 50 fish possession limit, a 10-inch total length size limit, and a season that's open year round. And as indicated by this yellow WHAM symbol, the minimum size limit does reflect a recent change implemented earlier this year, representing a 1-inch increase. So the size limit increased from 9 inches to 10 inches in federal waters. This table shows 2020 measures broken down by state. Measures in each state were restricted in 2022 compared to previous years, and such changes were similar to those made in federal waters, where each state implemented a 1-inch increase to their size limit. This 1-inch increase was made in response to RHL and recreational ACL overages in prior years, and although this change was not expected to prevent overages in 2022, it was intended to bring harvest closer to the RHL while considering resulting socioeconomic impacts of a full reduction. So this next few slides, I'm going to describe recent harvest trends. On this slide, you can see recreational catch, harvest, and dead discards over the past 10 years, including preliminary partial year wave 1 through 4 2022 data. Recreational harvest and catch has generally increased over the past 10 years. However, dead discards have remained relatively constant. And I'd also like to note that preliminary 2022 data is only about 3 million pounds below total harvest for 2021. So it's possible that total 2022 harvest will be similar or even an increase compared to 2021. For Scup, over the past 5 years, the majority of harvest has occurred in state waters, averaging at about 94% of total coastwide. As for recreational Scup harvest by mode, over the past 5 years, the majority of landings is by private or rental boats, averaging at about 61%, followed by landings from shore anglers at about 28%, and for hire trips at about 11%. So this table shows recreational harvest by state. From year to year, the greatest amount of harvest typically comes from New York, followed by Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey in no particular order. On the right-hand column, again, is that preliminary 2022 partial year data. And we just included this to give you an idea of where harvest is at by the state level for the current fishing year. So as discussed in the previous presentation, 2023 will be the first year that measures will be set using this percent change approach. This approach depends on two major factors. One, a comparison of the confidence interval around an expected harvest estimate of the upcoming year's RHL. And second, biomass stock status relative to the target. Over the next few slides, I'm going to try to break this down on a step-by-step basis as it pertains to Scup. So the next few slides goes over this first step. So again, that is looking at a harvest or a confidence interval around an estimate and comparing that to this year's RHL. For Scup, the monitoring committee recommends using the recreational fleet dynamic model, or RFDM. This model was the one developed by the Rhode Island DEM staff. And the monitoring committee voiced during that meeting that this model performed well and predicted past MRIP estimates reasonably well. They also appreciated that this model had the capability to consider recreational mode, especially given that many states have special for hire limits during parts of the year. And they also appreciated that this model could be easily used by various technical bodies and staff using a web-based interactive tool known as the RShiny app. So as for the confidence intervals needed for the first step, during the November monitoring committee meeting, the MC discussed what would be appropriate confidence interval, and they ultimately recommended using 80% for all three species. The 80% confidence interval was originally recommended by the Harvest Control Rule FMAT and PDT based on an evaluation of MRIP data, and the monitoring committee agreed that this recommendation was still appropriate given MRIP is the primary data source for both the RFDM and the RDM. The monitoring committee also agreed that higher percentage confidence intervals result in a wider range of values, and that could lead to scenarios where the resulting action under the percent change approach might not be appropriate for the true fishery. So for example, requiring a liberalization when there should be a reduction or vice versa. The monitoring committee also acknowledged and supported the need for continued discussion on this topic in 2023, ideally before setting 2024 measures and beyond. So the table at the top of this slide shows the model outputs for estimates of 2023 harvest under 2022 measures, with the monitoring committee recommended 80% confidence interval. As noted earlier and during Julia's presentation, we did get updated RDM outputs last week. So this table shows old RDM outputs at the top, the new RDM outputs in the center, and then RFDM outputs in the last row. And I'm just showing the three of these for comparison purposes. This year, we are kind of in a unique situation for Scup, where the confidence interval for one model, the RDM, suggests that the 2023 RHL is completely below or outside of that 80% confidence interval. And the monitoring committee recommended model, the RFDM, suggests the 2023 RHL is within the lower bounds of that confidence interval. And because of this situation, we'll go over the resulting percent change under both of these models. I'd also like to note that the monitoring committee did not reach consensus on the preferred model choice for 2023 for Scup. but the majority did recommend the RFDM as indicated on that previous slide. So first looking at the monitoring recommended model choice, the RFDM with the 80% confidence interval, as indicated, this would mean that the RHL falls within that confidence interval, which leads us in that center bin in that first column. Then if we consider Scup biomass from the results of the 2021 management track assessment, that suggests Scup is in this very high category in column 2, which then leads to 10% liberalization in that third and final column. However, another thing to consider for 2023 is the recreational accountability measures. As mentioned in the previous presentation, in October, Garfo sent a letter to the council indicating that the accountability measures for Scup were triggered this year. At the bottom here is the table of that evaluation. And Julia went over this at length, but I just want to draw your attention to the red bolded text at the bottom. So the Scup harvest, or Scup has been over the ACL by about 61% using that 3-year comparison. So since Scup biomass is greater than the target, the AMs listed under this scenario in the regulations require adjustments must be made. However, regulations do not specify how to make those adjustments. And then in that October Garfo letter, the agency indicated that because of recent actions taken by the council and commission, including revisions to the commercial and recreational allocation, the 1-inch increase to the minimum size limit in state and federal waters, and final action taken on the recreational harvest control rule, that no additional actions were needed to address the triggered AM for Scup. And this was also reiterated in that second letter from Garfo sent to us in December. So given all this recent fishery performance trends, and because the RFDM resulted in that 10% liberalization, the monitoring committee felt that a liberalization was not justifiable, and they therefore recommended status quo instead of the liberalization. So now moving on to the other model, the recreational demand model, or RDM. So during the November monitoring committee meeting, it was unclear at the time if the recommended status quo would satisfy the trigger AMs. The monitoring committee initially considered identifying the RDM as the preferred model choice, actually at the beginning of the meeting. And so they did then discuss preferred actions under the resulting percent change for the recreational demand model. I'd also like to note that although this was discussed during the meeting, the outcome of the meeting was that they preferred the RFDM and status quo, just to make that clear. So as described earlier, the RDM does result in a different percent change for Scup compared to the RFDM. So if we look at the percent change approach table at the bottom here, since the entire confidence interval around the RDM estimates the 2023 harvest is completely outside or above the 2023 RHL, that lands Scup in this last row of column 1. Then if we consider biomass for Scup again, that's again in that very high category, which then leads to a 10% reduction. So now using the percent change approach, that 10% reduction would then be applied to the harvest estimate for 2023 under 2022 measures. And the RDM estimate for that was 14.31 million pounds. And this is based off the updated values. So if we applied that 10% reduction to that, that would result in a harvest target of 12.88 million pounds. So to get a better idea of Scup measures needed to achieve this 10% reduction, alternative sets of measures were analyzed using the RDM. The first set of measures analyzed included a decrease to the possession limit to 15 fish across all states with status quo limits and seasons. This set of measures resulted in an estimated harvest of about 13.79 million pounds, which represents about a 4% decrease compared to that harvest estimate under 2022 measures. The second set of measures analyzed was a 1-inch increase to the size limit in all states with status quo possession and seasons. The second set of measures resulted in a greater decrease in harvest at about 10.49 million pounds, representing about a 27% reduction in harvest. The monitoring committee agreed that because changes to the size limit were implemented throughout 2022, changes to the possession limit might be most appropriate at this time. Some monitoring committee members expressed interest in modifying the season, but after some discussion, the group agreed changes to the season might be most appropriate at the regional or state level. And they agreed any changes coastwide would be challenging and could disproportionately impact some states. Some monitoring committee members did voice concern about a large decrease in the possession limit and how it may negatively impact the for-hire fleets. But given all this, the monitoring committee showed preference towards the 10% reduction scenario with the 15 fish possession limit and additional adjustments being made to state measures through the commission's process to achieve that full 10%. So getting into advisor feedback, the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass advisor panel met on November 30th to discuss 2023 measures for all three species. There were several general comments made related to all three species. One advisor expressed interest in using other recreational demand model outputs, such as angler welfare, to inform measures in future years. This advisor also expressed appreciation towards having two models for comparison purposes, especially in this first year of using them. However, he expressed concern that this would divide effort to maintaining both models into the future. Another advisor noted challenges following the process this year, given some of the substantial changes made. Another advisor noted the RDM is similar to the model used in the New England Fishery Management Council to set recreational cod and haddock measures, which appears to be working well for those fisheries. And then another advisor expressed concern related to the validity of MRIP data and frustration that MRIP information is still the main component of these two models. And he recommended electronic reporting for all private recreational anglers to improve recreational data overall. So getting into Scup specific comments, several advisors expressed frustration with the monitoring committee's recommendation for status quo in place of the liberalization. 4 of these advisors questioned the point of going through the process and providing advisor feedback if managers and/or GARFO are not even going to consider their feedback. One advisor said it seems like the monitoring committee is continuing to operate under an ad hoc approach rather than fully utilizing these new tools and following the newly approved process. And then another advisor expressed frustration that one model resulted in a 10% liberalization while the other in a 10% reduction. And this advisor said having multiple models overcomplicates the process and expressed concern that managers may pick and choose which model to use based on their preferred outcome. Specifically, 3 advisors spoke in favor of the 10% liberalization instead of the recommended status quo. And 2 of these advisors recommended decreasing the minimum size limit by 1 inch in state and federal waters, so reverting back to the 2021 size limits. 3 other advisors spoke in favor of the status quo recommendation, and they agreed it was appropriate given scup biomass, the restrictions implemented during this fishing year, and the continued expected recreational harvest limit overages. One advisor also noted that given one model results in a 10% liberalization and the other in a 10% reduction, status quo might be the most appropriate recommendation. He also noted that both model median results seem to be comparable, and the 2023 RHL is just barely within the lower bounds of the confidence interval of that RFDM. As for some of the other comments made during the Scup conversation, one advisor expressed disbelief in the discard numbers presented and questioned why regulations that allow for dead discards are even put in place. He recommended actions should be taken to prevent or minimize dead discards and recommended the council and board consider a total length limit in the recreational fishery with mandatory retention of all fish up to that cumulative limit, as well as mandatory private angler reporting to improve recreational data. Another advisor expressed concern on how the current AMs are designed. He said there is a current mismatch between the percent change approach and the accountability measures, and he questioned why the accountability measures were not updated to give greater consideration to whether or not recreational catch limits overages contributed to overfishing, as considered through the harvest control rule. He noted that current AMs are based on projections since they are evaluating against the ACLs that are set up using stock projections, while fishing mortality is a realized rate. He specifically recommended the council board take action to incorporate fishing mortality into each of the AM categories. So as you know, during the November monitoring committee meeting, the group recommended using the RFDM, but just last week, GARFO sent an additional letter to the council on determination of best available science. And a copy of that letter was sent to the council and board and is provided in supplemental meeting materials. In the letter, GARFO considered the recreational demand model, so the RDM, to be the best available science for setting 2023 measures, and recommended use of the RDM for all 3 species. The letter provides detail as to why the agency considers the RDM as the best available science, but some of the rationale, as Julia mentioned, included the RDM incorporates data on angler behavior, and the RDM has narrow confidence intervals compared to the RFDM. The recent GARFO letter was not provided, some of the information in the recent GARFO letter was not provided during the monitoring committee or AP meetings, and these concerns about the best available science were not expressed in this manner during those meetings. So in summary, the monitoring committee recommended using, again, that recreational fleet dynamic model as the tool to help setting 2023 recreational Scup measures. And because under the percent change approach that resulted in a 10% liberalization, the monitoring committee recommended maintaining status quo measures for Scup instead. However, given contents of that GARFO letter, that second GARFO letter, the council should discuss potential use of the recreational demand model and what that would mean for 2023 Scup measures. The MC, or the monitoring committee, did not formally discuss this letter, given it was sent to the council just late last week. However, during the November meeting, they did discuss potential scenarios, as I went over on a previous slide, and their preferred option under that scenario was that 15 fish possession limit, and states implementing additional adjustments through the commission process. And that concludes the presentation for Scup. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that presentation. I'm going to look around the table for any hands from council members, board members that have any questions regarding the presentation on Scup. There's a couple different directions we could take here, but let's do questions first, and then we'll get into comments and possible motions. Okay, I don't see anything popping up on my screen. Is there anyone from the audience that has any questions? Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Good morning, Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. Just a quick question, Mr. Chair, to staff. Does Scup have a target level?
A target level as in an RHL, or yes, it's 9.27 million pounds.
And how does that differ from the RHL?
The target level, so under the recreational demand model, it was 12.88 million pounds, so it's 3 million pounds higher than the RHL, give or take.
And who developed the policy of, or the definition and the analysis that set up the target level?
So that was under the framework, the Harvest Control Rule Framework Addenda and Addenda, sorry, titles. So that was discussed by the council and approved by the council.
And in this case, the target level is 3 million pounds higher than the RHL?
In this particular scenario, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else from the audience? I think I saw Victor, your hand up.
I have a few questions, and one I'm going to ask because I'm definitely going to get into it later. Here's a fishery that 3 years in a row went over. And not that I want to hurt my industry or anything, but a common sense thing, if an industry goes over by 138%, that means that the next year you're not going to get the fish for that fish because we went over, like way over. Now, we had a meeting where I sit there for free for 3 hours and then to get like this letter that came like a day later or 2 days later. So really our meeting meant nothing because here's what people are asking me. Are you going to pick whichever one of these programs best fits your scenario? Because it doesn't always best fit our scenario. And now if I'm reading this right, if we're going to go from 50 fish down to 15 fish, next year we'll probably lose a ton of head boats up in the New England section because nobody is going to hop on a head boat and go fishing for 15 scup. When really we shouldn't be fishing for scup. We went over 138%. Later on, we're going to get slammed with a sea bass, which sea bass we catch more sea bass than any other fish because we can't get away from them. Same with scup. I just don't understand like what we're doing here. Every year I come here and now I'm watching scup get totally obliterated down to 15 fish. It's going to put the party boat industry out of business. And I don't understand why I sit in a 3-hour meeting to be told later, here's what we were discussing. Oh, by the way, Garfo doesn't want to use that now and they're the ultimate authority. So what's the council have to do? What is the council doing if Garfo and the Science Center can come here and say that we're not using what we had discussed and they can't say why? Like who made that decision? Somebody needs to explain it to me because I'm starting to think I'm pretty stupid and people wonder why I come here to fight for the industry. I mean, I'd like somebody to tell me because I don't get paid.
No, I understand that, Victor, and I don't have an answer for you. I think your comment is well received, and I expect during the discussion of a possible motion that some of those questions will be answered. So I'm going to leave it there at this point.
And I mean, I'm not bringing it up. I'm only bringing up Scup and the over percentage because I don't understand if, say we leave here today and Scup stay at 50, and then we're going to go to sea bass, which we go over every year, but we're being penalized on sea bass like they're this magic fish, but we're not on Scup. If you're going to get penalized on one, why are we letting the other one liberalize or stay the same forever? Think about that when we get to sea bass. Because sea bass, you can't get away from them. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Given the couple comments that we've received, and so here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to change course a little bit here. I would like to come back to the council at this time. There will be opportunity for the public to weigh in during a deliberation surrounding a motion that's made. I'd like to get back to the table at this point. And the one question that I do, so Hannah, maybe you can clarify the decision points that we need to make today. If there's a slide that you might have prepared, or if you could just verbally kind of just, declare, let us know what needs to be done today.
Yeah, so if we go back to the objective slide, Stephen, which is slide 3, so those bottom 2 bullets would be what we need to identify today. So identify the appropriate model to be used for setting 2023 measures and the resulting percent change required under that preferred choice. And then if that results in any sort of reduction or liberalization, we'll have to adopt federal measures as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. So I'm going to bring it back to the board and to the council at this time for a possible consideration on a path forward. The monitoring committee recommendation was to use the recreational fleet dynamic model and maintain status quo. And the alternative would be to use the recreational demand model, which would, from what I'm gathering, would be a 10% reduction. Those are the two different paths that we can take. And so I'll look around the table for anyone that might, we have some motions already prepared, depending on the path that the board and the council want to take. So I'm going to look, of course, Justin Davis, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So Hannah, this is a follow-up question. Under a scenario in which these two bodies decided to adopt the RDM recommendation and a 10% reduction in harvest for, we would have to vote up measures today to achieve a 10% reduction in federal waters for recreational scup. What options do we have available to us for those measures at this point?
Yeah, so that's that table on slide 20. So that would be that 15 fish possession limit with status quo size limits or seasons, or the 1-inch decrease with status quo possession limits and seasons. But neither of those gets to that 10% reduction. Also keep in mind that federal waters is a small proportion of scup harvest in general. So, you know, we would just have to decide today what the federal measures would look like, and then states would then go through the commission process and implement any additional adjustments to their measures through that commission process. So it could look at in some shape or form like this. We just won't have, you know, what percent reduction that would achieve.
Thanks. So just to follow up, essentially, these two options on the table are the two options we have available to us today. If we were to adopt the RDM recommendations, there will not be an opportunity to develop additional options to reach the reduction we need to reach in federal waters. And then if one of these two options is adopted, there would need to be additional follow-on action by the states to achieve additional reductions in state waters to sort of make it all the way to the 10% overall reduction.
Yeah, so these are the only two options where we have the percent reduction associated with them. However, if this body decided that they wanted to do something that's not in this table, I think that's within the means. We'll just have to do an analysis of, you know, what percent reduction does that achieve, and then what would the states need to then implement in the commission process. So we wouldn't have the exact percent reduction that would achieve, but I'm sure, I imagine that we could be flexible in the situation. Oh, you're not held to these two. Does that make sense? Sorry. Okay.
All right, thanks, Hannah, for that. Mike Pitney?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think to Justin Davis's comment, I think there might be a third path forward also that the council and the board might want to consider. And this is largely due to the fact that such a small percentage of overall catch comes from federal waters. And that would be for the council and the board to recommend that federal waters measures remain status quo, provided that within state waters, the board is able to come up with suites of measures that would achieve the full 10% reduction coastwide. And I think if I'm assuming that makes what I'm saying makes sense, that's an opportunity, I think, for the council and the board to move forward and have a discussion about achieving a 10% reduction in state waters, but again, potentially leaving the federal waters measure status quo. I just offer that as a third path forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Go ahead, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hannah, I wondered, can you just remind us all what percentage on average of recreational scup harvest comes from federal waters?
It's about 4%.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, so given the different scenarios that we've been presented, I'm going to look to the board and the council at this time. What is the pleasure of these two bodies in moving forward? We have a couple different paths we can take, but I'd like to open up discussion based on some recommendation on a motion for how we proceed. We have the monitoring committee recommendation, and then we also have the alternative approach based on the two different models. Is anyone prepared or willing to start the discussion off? John Maniscalco?
So, Mr. Chair, I'm afraid I just have another question and not a definite motion for a path forward, if you're willing to entertain the question.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
So, one of the merits of the RFDM was the fact that state staff, monitoring committee members, and technical committee members could manipulate the Shiny app to develop measures. And I was just wondering how Garfo would consider use of the RFDM to calculate the reduction necessary. Obviously, we get a target of 12.88 million pounds from the RDM, but that is kind of almost a different currency. So because of the utility of the tool that the RFDM offers, how would Garfo allow us to consider outputs from the RFDM in this process? Thank you.
Mike Penny.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it's an interesting question because it's not something that we have previously, we don't typically get into the weeds with the commission in terms of the methods that they use to calculate the reductions associated with individual state proposals under conservation equivalency, particularly for Scup, because we don't have conservation equivalency in the federal plan. So to me, that's much more of an sort of internal commission, staff, board question. What we would be looking for is, ultimately is for the council to make a decision in terms of the percent reduction necessary, and then an understanding of whether and how that reduction would either come out of changes to coastwide measures under the federal plan, or an understanding that the board working through the state and their conservation equivalency process would figure out a way to achieve that necessary reduction in state waters. And the process and the methods that the board uses and the commission uses are less of a concern to me than meeting the overall objective.
All right, thank you, Mike. Tony Kearns, I saw your hand go down, but I'd certainly call on you if you had a question or a comment.
I was just going to remind the board or the body that the commission does not have traditional conservation equivalency for Scup like it does summer flounder and black sea bass.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Okay. Looking around the table, we need to get things started at some point here. I have Adam Nowalski's hand. Go ahead, Adam.
Somebody's got to do it, right? So where this leaves us is in a position where we have conflicting information. Overall, I think we are in a far better place this year from where we were with the percent change approach in front of us. The difficulties we have right now with regards to considering what is the right projected harvest, what is the configuration for those models and generating those are not questions that came about because of the percent change approach. The percent change approach expected a single input, the MRIP data. We now have an embarrassment of riches, if you will, in terms of we could continue to use the projected MRIP data. I don't advocate for that. We could use the RDM model. We could use the RFDM model. We could change the inputs to the RDM model, which gives us lots of different outputs. Wow, Christmas came early, right? But I think we run the risk here of ripping open those presents and finding ourselves with something we really didn't want here as a result of it. And again, this isn't an indictment of the percent change approach. We have significantly smaller changes, reductions, or liberalizations at hand than we would have had in previous years under the old approach. So I think we're all in a better place. The public's in a better place. The resources in a better place, which is most important. We're in a better place as managers. The service has made it very clear what their model preference is here at this point. I think they're going to weigh in very heavily on this discussion, but somebody's got to get the ball started. So I'm going to go ahead and make the motion for status quo for Scup for 2023, using the justification for that we have different models that are providing different projected harvests with different outcomes. We have the ability to go ahead and potentially change the inputs to the RDM. Again, somebody's got to get the ball rolling here, Mr. Chairman, so I'm going to go ahead and start with that as my motion. And I'll make that on behalf of both the board and the council.
Okay, Adam, if you could, so we have on the screen, if you can see either on your device or up on the screen, we have a prepared motion. If you could read that into the record, I'll call for seconds after that. Thank you.
So I would like to, from what I see before me with the prepared, I'd like to strike the language about the monitoring committee recommendation using the fleet dynamic model, because that's not what I'm doing here. I believe it's our job here to make a recommendation what the percent liberalization or reduction is that we need. If we go with status quo, we don't need to change measures, so we don't need states to go back home and start using a model to go ahead and change them. The rationale for my motion is not based on one model or the specific, it's based on that there are differences between those models. So I'm going to simplify the motion to move to adopt status quo recreational management measures for 2023, period. And I think you could strike the federal waters part with what's up there as well. And it's my intention for status quo recreational management measures, period.
Okay, I appreciate that, Adam, and you are making that on both behalf of the board and the council. So let me see we have the board up there on first. Are there any other members of the board? Ray Kane, you're going to second that motion? Okay. And on behalf of the council, is there anyone that would like to second that motion on behalf of the council? Paul Reese? Okay, thank you, Paul. All right, so we have a motion to discuss and debate. I will keep an eye on my screen, but I'll also look around the room if anyone wants to raise their hand to call on for discussion. Mike Pentney.
So since Adam kicked things off with a motion, I'll kick things off with comments. I think it's pretty obvious. I'm going to oppose the motion both for the commission, both for the board and the council. This motion is inconsistent with the Magnuson Act, point blank. This cannot be supported and it would not be approved should this come to us as the council's recommendation under the Magnuson Act. So I really urge the council and the board to reconsider this and look for an alternative that can be supported and approved under the Magnuson Act. I'll remind the council and the board also that we have not yet made a decision on the harvest control rule framework upon which this all action today depends. If we had expected to be able to work through the harvest control rule framework, the proposed rule will be publishing later. But I'll just suggest that when the agency looks at the harvest control rule framework, I don't expect that we're going to get 100% unanimous comments that say from everybody in the public saying the harvest control rule framework is should be approved. There will be a variety and probably some controversial comments on both sides. So we're going to have to look carefully at that. If the council and the board, act today inconsistent with the Magnuson Act, that's going to probably inform our decision on the harvest control rule framework. So please keep an open mind and be thinking big picture and how we move recreational management forward and not backwards. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that comment, Mike. It's a pretty strong statement. Are there any other thoughts from the board or the council at this time on this motion or a possible alternative motion? Justin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tried to do it the right way that time and put my hand up on the webinar. First, I just have a question for Mike, and could you remind these bodies what the implications would be if we sent a recommendation for status quo Scup recreational management measures that GARFO ultimately felt they couldn't approve? What would happen then?
That's a good question. I think, we would probably inform the commission in particular of the need to achieve a 10% reduction coastwide. We might find ourselves in a position where we would have to, especially given, as staff reported, such a small percentage of the total catch comes out of federal waters. As we had a debate last year, we would be looking at whether we need to close the federal Scup fishery entirely in order to achieve as much of a reduction as possible, given our limited ability to affect total Scup catch.
Thanks, Mike. And as a follow-up, I guess something I'd like to get on the record here or have a little bit of discussion about. I think, what's underlying our discussion right now on this motion and the general topic here is the issue that we had two models available that were used during monitoring committee deliberations and the advisory panel, but that subsequently there was a decision that one of those models was the best available science. We heard some discussion during the earlier agenda item where it was sort of framed as the work on the RDFM model was wasted time, or that, ultimately, we should have known at an earlier point that only one model was going to be acceptable for management use and just focused on that model. Is it the attitude of the Science Center or GARFO that going forward, there should be only one model used in this process to, project harvest and develop measures? Or should we continue to work on both models? Are both models viable going forward? Essentially, I'm just trying to get on the record whether there's been a decision made that the RDFM model should sort of no longer be used going forward, or should we continue to work on both models?
Mike?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. I'm going to ask John Hare to fill in from his perspective from the Science Center. But, our intention was that for today's decision-making for 2023, we wanted to ensure that the council and the board were informed in advance of today that we made a determination for today and for 2023 that in light of all that we understand about the two models and the information going forward, that we consider the RDM to be the best available science today. That does not preclude refinements and improvements to both models that may help us reach a different conclusion in the future. And I would look to, and certainly be informed by my partner, John Hare at the Science Center. But science evolves and models evolve and improvements can be made that can be helpful in many ways in terms of the starting point for a discussion to implement the percent change approach, or approaches that the board and the commission staff need to use to evaluate conservation equivalency proposals. So I think there are definitely opportunities to move forward and continue to evolve and improve the models. But I would look to John Hare to see his thoughts as well.
John, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I agree with Mr. Pentney's perspective. This sounds trite, I guess is the word. This sounds trite, but I think it's true. Science is a process. And the effort to continue to improve science is not wasted. At this point in time, we have a decision to make, and that decision has been sort of framed by Mr. Pentney's letter. But that does not mean that there's not value in continued improvement in the RFDM model and continued improvement in the RDM model. The SSC put forward a number of recommendations for improvement of both, and I know both teams have been working hard to improve those models. So I hear Dr. McNamee's perspective that it was wasted time. And in a sense, there was some wasted time there, but improving that our FDM model is not wasted time. this was not used to inform this decision. I think Hannah, so you mentioned, the peer review was in September 2021. I do think having another peer review evaluating these two models again would be a useful exercise for us, because I think there is going to be value in both in the future.
All right, I appreciate that, John. And I appreciate the questions and comments, both by my co-chair and the service and the Science Center. I don't do this often, but I am going to express my frustration in where we are right now. There's been significant amount of resources put into the discussions leading up to today about where we go regarding the two models that are being used. And, I'm personally, I'm frustrated that just a few days ago, we were told that we only had one choice. It's, I thought I've had a number of conversations with many of you around the table about possible ideas and opportunities for how we proceed with scup, sea bass, and flounder. And I just want to express and put on the record my frustration with just the timing and I feel like we're in the corner, we're backed up against the wall, and we really don't have any choices at this point, based on the comments that we got from Garfo about disapproving anything that's not using the RDM model. So we can still vote on this, and we can submit it. I'm not seeing any, well, actually, I do see some hands pop up right now. Have Justin, and John, is your hand still up from earlier?
No, sir.
Okay, I'm going to go to a couple folks around that I see their hands up, and we'll see where we end up. We are a little bit over time at this point, but that's okay. We'll keep at it until we get this right. I'm going to start with Emerson Hasbrook. Go ahead, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
You're a little bit faint, but if you can speak up a little bit.
Is this any better?
That's better, Emerson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we just heard Mr. Petney say that he's opposed to this motion and will not approve it because it's inconsistent with Magnuson. He also mentioned that this action with Scup, or the proposed action with Scup, may jeopardize approval of the framework because this possible action today is not within Magnuson. So my question is, if we approve something today and the regional administrator does not approve it, and then the regional administrator, or I guess I should say NIMS, does not approve the framework that's already been sent along to them, then where does that leave us?
Mike?
Thanks, Chairman. I think so. Emerson's asking kind of a two-part question, which is what if the agency, if I disapprove the rec measures recommended by the council today, and then also disapprove the recreational harvest limit framework that's been submitted by the council, where would that leave us for 2023? And I guess my answer is we'd be back to the old system that the recreational harvest framework, control rule framework was intended to replace. And under the old system where we apply MRIP or an estimate of 2023 catch against the RHL, we'd be looking at between a 35 and a 47% reduction, depending on whether you use the output of the RDM model to drive that or the simple point estimate from MRIP. So arguably a much worse place to be in than the 10% reduction we're urging the council and the board to adopt today.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Emerson, do you have any follow-up?
Oh, no, that answers the question. Thank you. I'll put my hand on.
Okay, thank you. Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I'm a little confused. Based on John Maniscalco's question about use of the RFDM for development of state waters measures for Scup. I thought I understood Mike to say that, the agency generally doesn't get in the weeds of that, because of the lack of conservation equivalency that we have for Scup. But I think when I read the letter that was written December 8th and that we received, it sounds, it's clear that the RDM is the model that has been determined to be best scientific information available. I guess what I'm having a difficult time reconciling, or what I'm confused about, is how you could use, one model to establish, the target, but a different model to potentially establish measures. And I know the monitoring committee talked about this, and I thought that the consensus of the monitoring committee was that you would want to use the same model throughout, for both components of our spec setting. Am I missing something, or can someone please unconfuse me? Thanks.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just to try to hopefully close the loop on this. The only decision point today that for Scup that I need to evaluate to ensure it is consistent with the Magnuson Act is the action of the council. And the action of the council, in my mind, would be to recommend a 10% reduction, no change in catch, or 10% liberalization. Those are sort of the three options that were at least discussed given the results of the models. That's the decision point that comes as a council recommendation for 2023. Coastwide measures to achieve a 10% reduction could either come as changes to coastwide federal measures, or a proposal that coastwide federal measures remain status quo and a 10% reduction in overall catch or overall harvest is achieved through changes in state waters where the vast majority of the harvest occurs. That's the decision point that I have to approve and ensure is consistent with the Magnuson Act. How the commission gets to the 10% reduction in catch, if that's the decision that ultimately is made, is not something that gets evaluated under the Magnuson Act.
Are you good, Tony? Okay. Okay, I'm going to take two more comments, questions, and then we're going to have to make some decision points here. Jason McNamee.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Maybe I will just sort of jump back to the motion here and just voice my support for Mr. Nowalski's motion. The discourse that we've been having on Magnuson, and I guess I understand it that there's just this dictum that comes down from Garfo with regard to best scientific information available. But I think about what Adam offered, and I think there could be a legitimate discussion to be had that, in essence, the way I understood what Adam, he was careful in the way he talked about it, but my understanding of what he's doing is he's looking at these two models and sort of averaging them. We got, mixed information between the two, and to kind of accommodate the mixed signal amongst these two models, which is a very progressive scientific thing to do. He is suggesting remaining at status quo. Now, I don't know at what point, maybe it's never, we get to have this discourse to talk about this interpretation of Magnuson and what best scientific information available is. It hasn't happened yet, but I just suggest maybe this motion forces that issue. I think we can make a very compelling case as to how both the board and the council end up at this decision, what it's based on, and we can have that discourse at that point. So I just wanted to voice some support for what for the motion that's up in front of us here.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Last comment, Dewey Hemmelwright?
It seems like if, given what we've heard from Garfo, that this would not be approved, and the outfall, as Mike has described it, and if Garfo is forced to, based on the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, it could be a 30 or 40% reduction to adhere to the standards. Yeah, I just don't see no other way. I mean, if you want to have the context of Magnuson or something, that could be for another day. But for me, I can't support this motion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dewey. I think we are in a really tight spot right now, based on the comments that I've heard. There is an alternative path, which would be to recommend status quo in federal waters and a 10% reduction in state waters, which would be less problematic to the industry, to the recreational fishing community, than what Mike mentioned as what they would do if they disapproved this recommendation moving forward. So I'll just offer that as another option. Dewey?
I'm just curious, if it's status quo in federal waters and you go in federal waters and catch fish and you got to come back through state waters, go back to your dock, how does, and if state waters is less than federal waters, your bag limit or whatever happens there, how does that difference get reconciled? You understand what I'm saying? I mean, federal, obviously it would be two different things than state waters and federal. If you stay status quo in federal and the 4% or whatever goes and catch fish in federal and come back into state waters, how does that work with enforcement?
Well, from my understanding of that, Dewey, you would be responsible for maintaining whatever state you're going back to. You would be under the enforcement would happen if you're at the dock. That's whatever state you're in that you're landing. You'd have, when you're in federal waters, you wouldn't be able to catch and hold the federal waters limit if the state waters limit's different. You're going to be restricted to the more restricted measure.
So basically, status quo in federal is just a paper exercise, and then the states decide whether they want to allow that or have to do something in a reduction. All right, I understand that, so thank you.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is, Dewey. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
You can speak up a little bit, Roy, it'd be helpful. Thank you.
All right. How about that?
That's better.
I just wanted to point out that Mike Petney warned us earlier that if this particular motion is approved, federal action might include a moratorium on harvest in federal waters. Now, that may not have a large impact in New England, but it would virtually shut down any scup fishery from Delaware south, since most of the harvest of legal size scup comes from federal waters. Now, previously, Dr. Hare talked about an offer of doing further work on the modeling to maybe reconcile some differences in the model results. I'm assuming that that probably is impractical to do before 2023 harvest setting. So I'm really in a quandary as to what to do with this motion. I support the motion, but I don't like the results that have been forecast from our federal partners. And so I'm unsure where to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. I think a lot of people around the table feel the same way. And just to acknowledge your point about 2023, I was looking down the table. Dr. Hare was nodding his head as you mentioned the fact that this is not going to be something that can be resolved before we set measures for 2023. Joe Semino.
It's not going to be helpful. But I have to agree with Roy. You know, I just happened to be sitting next to a fellow board member from Maryland, and you know, New Jersey and Maryland are often portrayed as, you know, evil for putting forward proposals on a species called striped bass, where we're actually trying to achieve those reductions on, and we're there on paper. And here, you know, we're talking about a fishery that's been 61% over. Some tough decisions have to be made. And unfortunately, oddly enough, if NIMS goes forward with what they're suggesting, it's going to be the states of New Jersey South that are going to be in a real quandary. But this is New England's decision to make, and I hope they will consider 10% over 40%. And so I'm not willing to make a motion. I'm just saying I think it's you know, time to get there, and the states that have these fisheries need to make some real decisions.
I appreciate that, Joe. Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this question, I think, is to Hannah and Tracy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but just thinking about the position we're in now versus next year. So right now we're setting measures for 1 year. We'll be back here next year after we have stock assessments for, I'm sorry, I don't recall offhand if it's all 3 species, but next year we will essentially be engaging in this process again and setting measures for 2 years, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Okay. Look and see what hands I have. I've got Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I consider an alternative motion, I just need a final bit of clarity. The letter from Garfo indicated that a recommendation from the council to increase scup harvest by 10% would be inconsistent with National Standard 2. What we're being told today is that this motion for status quo, not an increase of 10%, would be inconsistent with National Standard 2. Do I have that correct?
Mike?
Sorry. Yes, the intent is that what we have made a determination is the best available science calls for a 10% reduction in harvest for 2023. Any recommendation of the council short of achieving a 10% reduction in harvest would not be consistent with National Standard 2.
Nicola?
Thank you for the clarification. I feel as though our hands are tied here, and the alternative outcome of this motion is much more consequential and negative to all states. So for that reason, I'm going to modify or make a substitute, but I also want to discuss the consideration of not changing federal waters measures. And through the commission process, generally speaking, that means that the southern states still mirror the federal waters measures and the northern region takes the entire cut. And I'm looking to Tony Kearns for kind of a agreement with that statement.
If we stay status quo in federal waters, that would be correct.
Okay.
I guess a question could be to the regional offices if through our deliberations on state water measures, if you wanted to make a small adjustment to federal waters, would they be able to deliberate that through the rulemaking process or not? You wanted to make a small tweak to them after the fact.
So what I would like to do is make a motion to require a 10% harvest reduction for 2023 Scup recreational management as estimated using the recreational demand model. And this is long, so I could give it to staff. It would be easier. And adopt a 10-inch minimum size, 40 fish bag limit, and May 1 to December 31st open season for 2023 recreational Scup measures in federal waters, with the states to further modify state measures through the commission process to achieve a 10% coastwide harvest reduction.
Okay, I appreciate that, Nicola. If you could send that over to, I don't know who's running the board, Hannah. We'll get that up on the screen. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just waiting until we have it up on the board for everyone to see before I ask for a second. So just hold tight for a sec. We're getting it done. Okay, so we do have a motion before us, a substitute motion made by a member of the commission's board, Nicola Meserve. Let me see if we can get is there anybody that wants to second this on behalf of the board? Emerson, I see your hand. Are you seconding this motion?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I am seconding this to initiate discussion about it, but I do have some questions. But anyhow, yes, I'll second this.
Okay, thank you. Let me look to members of the council. Is there anyone from the council that would like to make this like motion? Dan Farnham will make the motion.
Yes, I'd like to make that motion. Thank you.
And Chris, are you seconding? Okay, Chris Bat-Savage is going to second the motion, so we have a motion for debate. I'll turn it over for discussion. Tony?
Just a point of clarification to the regional office. I believe that in the past, we've discussed federal water measures in particular, and that the closures that we do early on actually don't take into effect. And so therefore, there would really be no reduction associated with those closures. And I just want to make sure that I am clear on that. Because when we have tried to change, let's say, the wave 1 and 2 fisheries in the past, we have always said that you need to do it 2 years in advance instead of the year before in order to make that happen. So I would come back and just ask that same question that I asked before, is if we did need to tweak the federal water measures some through the commission process, would you be able to accommodate that through the rulemaking process?
So that's a fair, Mr. Chairman. Thanks. It's a fair point. You know, I really appreciate the intent of this motion. I think this is a really important and strong step forward. But yeah, to Tony's question, the rulemaking, the timeline for rulemaking for setting the 2023 measures, particularly with conservation equivalency, there's a back and forth between the regional office and Tony and the commission around conservation equivalency. That often means we can't act in terms of a final rule until you know, April, even May. And so, and the current measures, which would be 10-inch 50 fish bag limit and open year round, will remain in place until we get that rule in place. And so, you know, we would certainly strive by May 1, when the season, when the fishery really starts to take off, is to have these measures in place. But it probably would not affect the season on, you know, for federal waters until 2024, just because of the timing for getting our regulations in place, working through the commission process.
Okay, thanks for that. John Maniscalco, and then Adam, I'm going to come to you, and then we're going to have to vote on this because we need to move forward. John, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering if a friendly amendment would be considered that change the language to say move to adopt a 10% harvest reduction as required by the percent change approach and adopt a 10-inch minimum size limit. And my intent is to give the commission as much flexibility in how they determine what that 10% reduction looks like. Thank you.
So are you suggesting removing the recreational demand model language?
That is correct.
Well, I guess we can consider it. I'll look to the makers.
I would be comfortable with that change. It still achieves the same outcome for me. Thank you.
Dan?
Yep, agreed.
Emerson?
Yes, I'm good with that. Thank you.
Chris?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead, and I appreciate that, John. Let's see if we can, so move to adopt a 10% harvest reduction. We'll remove the language on the model. Okay. So we have a friendly amended motion at this time. I'm going to go to Adam and then Nicola. Is your hand up for a comment? Okay, go ahead, Adam.
Thank you. So just speaking specifically to the motion ahead of us and not comparing the two motions, I can't support the motion as written due to the open season constraint of the May 1st to December 31st. Given the very small portion of harvest that comes from federal waters, Given that encompasses wave one, which isn't even going to be sampled for most of those, I do not see any conservation benefit on paper that's going to go ahead and be gained by having that language. I could only support a change in this would have to include, for consideration for me, would have to include year-round opening for federal waters. I don't know if you're willing to go 3 levels deep and accept that as an amendment to the motion at this point, or what the preferred venue for the chair would be to debate that modification to this motion, Mr. Chairman. But I would be prepared if you would accept it as an amendment on behalf of the board and council to change May 1, December 31 to year round.
Yeah, Adam, I appreciate that. And I was kind of thinking along the same lines. So here's what I'd like to do. Instead of getting ourselves 3 levels down, I think what I'd like to do is call the question on this motion. If it passes or fails, then I would accept a substitute or an amended motion to whether or not this moves forward before we go ahead and get 3 levels deep. Okay. Okay, with that said, Nicola, you got the last word. If you're willing to make a friendly, maybe at this point, I don't know, we could maybe do it that way as well. You let me know.
It's a bigger question than I was going to comment on right now. But I just wanted to throw a brief opportunity to speak to the motion that, as I said, I think our hands are tied with a 10% reduction at this point, and I want to ensure that there is some equity in the way that is addressed among the states and the regions. And while I recognize that a very small amount of the harvest is coming from south of New York or New Jersey, that we all should be chipping in, and the measures are on other species when we have done it in a state by state, or only one region takes a cut, leads to increasingly disparate measures. And it is one of the greatest frustrations of the anglers from my state when they look at other states' measures. And so this tweaking here from the current federal waters measures is meant to address that and ensure that that all states contribute in some part to the reduction that is required. What we've seen so far from the analysis indicates that the northern region states will still have to make some significant cuts in order to make up for a 10% cut here. So it is a smaller request from the states with smaller harvest. Regarding the season change, I understand that most likely wouldn't take place, or would not take place until 2024. However, I think that it's very likely we're going to be at this table again for 2024 looking at a 10% cut. And so the doing it now sets us up potentially in 2024 to do that. There's very little harvest that occurs January through April for Scup. What I have seen in both New York and Massachusetts is a wave 2 estimate that is beyond ridiculous, that Massachusetts harvested 40% of its Scup in 2020, I believe it was, in March and April. And that is an estimate that is beyond comprehension, and it would do us better to close that wave and not have these very spurious estimates feeding into the harvest calculations. So that's where I was coming from with the January through April closure, in part to get rid of these MREP outliers and probably have very little impact on the harvest in the states. So if this would pass, I'd certainly be interested to entertain a amendment to change that season though.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and vote this up or down and see where we go from there. I'm gonna read the motion into the record. And does the board need? Let's take 2 minutes for a board caucus, and then I'll call the question to the council, and then Justin can call the question to the board. Thank you. All right, my co-chair was holding us up here with his discussions with his counterparts. So, okay, we have a motion. We're going to take a vote and we'll make decisions from there. So the substitute motion is, excuse me, move to adopt a 10% harvest reduction for 2023 Scup recreational management and adopt a 10-inch minimum size limit, 40 fish possession limit, and May 1 through December 31 open season for the 2023 recreational Scup measures in federal waters, with the states to fully modify state measures through the commission process to achieve a 10% coastwide harvest reduction. Roy, can you please put your hand down at this time before we take there we go. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to ask, I'm going to call the question first for the council. If you can raise your hand online, we'll take a tally, and then I'm going to move things over to my co-chair to call the question for the board. So all those in favor of the motion on behalf of the council, please raise your hand. Yeah, I got a count of 17. 2, okay. Okay, if you can clear your hands on that, please. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I have 3 opposed. Any abstentions? With no abstentions, the motion carries 17-3-0 for the council. And I'm going to turn things over to Justin Davis to call the question of the board.
Okay, thank you. To the board, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand on the webinar. And Tony Kearns has agreed to read off the states.
Thanks, Mr. Davis. I have Delaware, North Carolina, Maryland. Hold on, it shifted. Virginia, Rhode Island, NOAA Fisheries. Can't remember if I said Maryland before. New York and Massachusetts.
Okay, I'll ask everyone to put their hands down. Just voted. I'll wait till all the hands are down. Okay. All those opposed, please raise your hand.
New Jersey.
Okay. I'll wait till all the hands are down. Any abstentions?
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Okay, and any null votes?
Connecticut.
Okay, the motion passes the board, 8 in favor, 1 opposed with 1 abstention and 1 null vote.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, so we now have a new main motion. Is there any discussion on this new main motion this time? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you very much. Now that it is the main motion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion on behalf of the board and the council to amend and replace May 1st to December 31st with year-round, or January 1st to December 31st, whatever's the pleasure of whoever's typing things up.
Yeah, I think that would be, so that would be a motion to amend, and we would just need to clarify the season. So motion to amend to modify the season to January 1 through January 1 instead of May 1st. I think that'd be the simplest way to do it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Once we get it up on the board, I'll look around for seconds on behalf of the council and the board. Okay, so this is the full motion amended. I guess we can do it that way. Instead of trying to, that's fine. It's fine that way. So we have a motion on behalf of the council and the board made by Adam Nowalski. Let me ask the council if there's anyone who'd like to second that motion. Paul Reese, second the motion. Okay. And on behalf of the board, Roy Miller.
Mr. Chair, may I also ask a question? Can we in fact do this without a 2/3 vote? Would a simple majority carry this vote?
Yes.
Okay.
It's just an amended motion from the main motion. So yes. Are you going to second the motion, Roy?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. We have a motion for discussion. I'll take maybe one or two comments. If anyone has any comments, or we can vote this up or down at this time. Tom Foti?
Yeah, I'm going to ask if you're going to ask the public, since I'm a member of the public, Peter Clark is there representing me, so I'll be asking questions of the public, so unless all the public can ask questions, I wouldn't ask the question.
It was very hard to understand you, Tom.
What I said was, since I'm a member of the public at this meeting, since my proxy is there, if you're not recognizing the public to make comments, I won't make any comment right now.
He wants a public comment.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I just wasn't hearing it well from my seat. I can entertain a comment or two from the public, but I'm going to go to Chris Bat-Savage. I'll go out for maybe one or two comments from the public, and then we'll go ahead and call the question. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the challenges with getting a closed season at the beginning of the year in place for 2023, although it could roll over and possibly be in place for 2024. But I don't support the motion to amend to make it a year-round fishery in federal waters, despite the low landings. I think having some consistency with the seasons between state and federal waters is always a good thing. Regulations in general, really. But also, I think Nicola's point about having surprises during those shoulder waves and like wave 2, where you don't have a lot of intercepts, but one could heavily influence the catch estimates, I think is one that everyone should really give a lot of thought to. And even though we're not going to really get a measurable benefit from having wave 1 closed, since no states north of North Carolina sample in wave 1, that doesn't mean there isn't some sort of just kind of unquantifiable reduction or benefit to the stock. They're essentially free fish when you have seasons open, but you're not monitoring that fishery. So that's why I cannot support this amended motion. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Chris. Paul Reese, I'm going to turn to you as seconder for the council. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, this is not going to do anything for us this year, and the 10% reduction is going to be difficult to serve to people, and at least having a year-round season is going to make it easier for states to ease the pain. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, is there anyone from the audience that would like to provide comment? I see one hand, so I'll take that one hand. Victor?
The one thing I'd like to ask, a lot of the problems that we have here are accurate data. The for-hire sector has accurate data. So if it went to a year-round fishery, I know in New Jersey, probably most of the year-round guys in January, February are the big head boats that are running trips for porgies. Why couldn't in some of these motions we start separating? Not that I want to hurt the recreational anglers, I don't. But the party boat guys keep records on every trip we make. And they could be, we're like, let's just say we're 10%. I don't know what the magic number is. I know for bluefish, it's really low. But why couldn't they have, if you give the party boats and you don't change their season or their bag numbers that much, you're not hurting them. Say a party boat can keep 10 or 50 scup or whatever it is, and a recreational angler can only keep 30. You're still going to achieve your goal, but you're not going to affect the guys that are doing this for a living. And those guys are reporting. Until you can figure out how to get recreational guys to report, that is always going to be a problem here every year. But the guys that are using the iPads like we do every day, we're reporting every day. You know what we catch. Whether we fish in January, February, March, you're going to know our numbers like a commercial guy coming into a dock weighing the fish. Can we be off a little bit? Maybe. But a lot of us keep pretty good records. And another thing that I'd love the council to start, and I'll bring this up in sea bass, something that somebody told me, party boats could have days at sea or a size, like if you're allowed 30 inches of fish, it doesn't matter how you get the 30 inches, as you have a number of fish for the boat, and we're going to loot, that's going to help with dead discards. And no head boat's going to keep a 5-inch flounder or a 2-inch scup or whatever, however small. We're going to regulate ourselves. But I think you need the year-round industry, and I think you need to start separating the party boats off because we're not taking a majority of the fish. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Victor, and Tony can correct me if I'm wrong, but at the state level, there's an opportunity to do that. We are going to have a discussion later today about follow-up to the recreational reform discussion that we've had with the policy board as to whether or not sector separation should be something that we move forward with. So, you know, if you're sticking around, we'll have more discussion about that later, but I appreciate your thoughts. Okay, with that said, I think it's time that we call the question. The council went first last time, so I'm going to go to our board chair, Justin Davis, for calling the question on behalf of the commission.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just look to the board real quick to see if any board members feel like they need the time to caucus. You can either raise your hand on the webinar or right here in the room. Just wanted to check. All right, not seeing that, we'll go ahead and call the question for the board. I'll ask all those in favor to raise their hand on the webinar.
Just gonna give it a second to settle. I have Delaware, New Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland.
Okay, and I'll ask those folks who just voted to put their hands down. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand.
I have NOAA, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and that's all.
Okay, folks could go ahead and put their hands down. Any abstentions?
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Okay, and any null votes?
No nulls.
Okay, the motion fails at the board. 4 in favor, 6 opposed with 1 abstention.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Given the fact that the motion fails the board, we will not call the question to the council, and therefore the motion itself fails. So we're back to the original substitute motion, which is now the main motion. And I'm going to go ahead back just to make sure everyone's aware of what we're voting on. This was the motion that had the May 1st start time for the season, and that now is our main motion. Is there any need to caucus? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and again and I'm going to read this back and, well, I'll read it back into the record so that we know what we're voting on, and then I'm going to call the question of the council. So now the main motion, move to adopt a 10% harvest reduction for 2023 Scup recreational management and adopt a 10-inch minimum size limit, 40 fish possession limit, and May 1 through December 31 open season for 2023 recreational Scup measures in federal waters, with the states to further modify state measures through the commission process to achieve a 10% coastwide harvest reduction. So that is now our main motion. I'm going to call the question of the council. Tom, if you can put your hand down. There, thank you very much. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. $16. Okay, that's 16 in favor. If you can lower your hands, please. All those against? Or all those opposed? I have 4. Any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries the council 16-4-0. I'm going to turn it over to Justin for the board.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the board, all those in favor, please raise your hand.
I, Virginia, NOAA Fisheries, Massachusetts, Delaware, Connecticut, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and New York and Maryland.
Okay, let's wait for the hands to clear. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand.
New Jersey,
Okay, any abstentions?
Potomac River Fisheries Commission,
Any null votes?
no nulls.
Okay, the motion carries the board 9 in favor, 1 opposed with 1 abstention.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate the discussion over the last couple hours. Hannah, is there anything else that needs to come before us for Scup today?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've discussed with Justin and Chris about proceeding. We're about an hour over where we should be at this time. What I'd like to do is take just a couple minutes very quickly to get set up for our black sea bass. I know we're up against lunch and people are getting hungry. What I'd like to do is have the presentation be given for black sea bass, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions. We'll then take our lunch break and come back and begin after lunch with a motion. So if everyone wants to just stretch their legs for a couple minutes, we'll come back in just a couple minutes to start with sea bass. Thank you. Okay, if folks can start to take their seats, we're going to get started in about a minute. Thank you. Thirty seconds. 30-second warning. Okay, welcome back, everybody. As I mentioned before the short break, I'm going to go ahead and ask staff. We have Julia Beatty and Tracy Bauer here with us from the council and the commission, respectively, to provide us the presentation on black sea bass. We'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. We'll take a lunch break and come back and kick things off after lunch with a motion to start the discussion. So, Julia, if you're all set, you can go ahead and get started.
Yep, ready to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to cover the first part of the presentation, and then Tracy's going to take over at the end for the board-specific issue of the Virginia February fishery. So I don't need to go over this slide in detail, but you're all aware that we've had multiple steps in this process and some recent information that came out last week, and all those sorts of discussions that were part of the discussion for Scup. This is similarly impacting black sea bass in terms of the timing of all this information and how it's playing into the recommendations. So the objectives of the black sea bass discussion are similar as for Scup, but with some differences in the specific measures that you need to approve today. So before we get into that, we'll first review some high-level information on recent recreational fishery performance, review the monitoring committee recommendations, review advisory panel input, and then the objective is, well, we were hoping that the council and board could identify the appropriate model to use for setting 2023 recreational measures and the resulting percent change needed under the percent change approach. And then the council and board also need to approve today the use of either coastwide measures or conservation equivalency for black sea bass. And so under this version of conservation equivalency, the federal waters measures would be waived. And you would also need to approve non-preferred coastwide measures and precautionary default measures to go along with that. And then there will be discussion of the Virginia proposal to open their February recreational fishery. And there'll be a consideration of if the board will approve that proposal. So that'll be a board-only decision, but the council can discuss that as desired. So jumping into recent fishery performance, first wanted to note that, as I'm sure you're all aware, the black sea bass measures in virtually every state were restricted in 2022 compared to prior years. And the goal was to reduce harvest to prevent an overage of the 2022 RHL. And you can see the measures on the screen here. They do vary by state, and the way that each state took that reduction, the goal was to overall achieve a 20.7% reduction in harvest compared to a recent year average. And the states and regions achieved that differently, so it wasn't like there was a uniform across the board way of modifying measures to achieve that reduction. But virtually every state restricted their measures in 2022. 2022 was also the first year that federal waters measures were waived for black sea bass through the conservation equivalency process. So the measures on the screen here are really what were impacting harvest in 2022. So in terms of the conservation equivalency measures, there are part of the process for waiving federal waters measures that the council and board need to agree on a set of non-preferred coastwide measures. And these are measures that are, they're written into the federal regulations, but then waived in favor of the state regulations if it can be demonstrated that the collection of the state regulations achieves the same level of expected harvest as the non-preferred coastwide measures. So through last year, the target level of harvest for the non-preferred coastwide measures was the RHL. So, and then moving forward, the target level of harvest will be defined through the percent change approach. So these are measures that if they were implemented in a uniform fashion in all states and federal waters measures would achieve whatever the relevant target level of harvest is for that year. And then you can see the measures on the screen there that were used for 2022. And then as part of this process, the council and board also need to agree to precautionary default measures. And these are measures that would be used for any state or region that fails to put forward a proposal that follows the guidelines under the board process. So these are meant to be deterrent measures. They're meant to look really scary to help the process move forward and ensure that the states and regions are following the guidelines. And so neither of these measures are intended to actually be used if the decision is to waive the federal waters measures, but they're both needed under the process. So this slide shows recent harvest trends through 2021, which is the most recent complete year of information. And it's broken down by state, so the different colors are for the different states. And if you look at the 2021 value, you can see that almost 12 million pounds of harvest occurred in 2021, which makes it the second highest estimate of harvest in the entire time series of all the MRF data going back to 1981. The only other estimate that was a little bit higher was that 2016 estimate. You can also see from this figure that Massachusetts through New Jersey account for most of the harvest, despite having more restrictive measures than Delaware through North Carolina. For example, on average across 2019 through 2021, Massachusetts through New Jersey accounted for 89% of the black sea bass recreational harvest in weight. So that's high-level summary of the information through 2021. And as was noted earlier, for 2022, we only have preliminary data through wave 4, which is August. And that information suggests that through wave 4, 5.36 million pounds of black sea bass have been harvested. And the figure on the screen here shows only the wave 1 through 4 estimates by year. So you can see that although the preliminary wave 1 through 4 estimate is 31% lower than last year's final wave 1 through 4 estimate, it is actually pretty close in line with the estimates for 2018 through 2020, because last year's value was higher than the previous year's values. So again, the restrictions that were implemented in 2022, we currently have a limited ability to assess the impacts of those restrictions because we only have this preliminary data through August, but those are the trends that it's showing so far. And then next, kind of getting into what are we looking at in terms of what needs to be done for next year. I don't think I need to go over this slide in detail because I think you're all aware by now that we need to follow the percent change approach that the Council and Policy Board approved for use for the species starting with 2023. And again, the first step is to consider an estimate of what we think next year's harvest would be if we left this year's measures in place, as well as a confidence interval around that estimate. And as you are also aware, we have 2 new tools available to us to come up with those estimates: the recreational demand model, the RDM, and the recreational fleet dynamics model, the RFDM. So when we discussed this at the monitoring committee meeting, they recommended use of the recreational fleet dynamics model for setting the 2023 black sea bass recreational measures. So as was previously mentioned, there were the 2 model results were presented to the monitoring committee, and then the recreational demand model, or RDM, results were later modified. And based on the results that were discussed at the monitoring committee meeting, the 2 models produced very similar estimates for black sea bass. So you can see that on the screen here. The previous version of the RDM that the monitoring committee considered estimated 11.05 million pounds of black sea bass harvest in 2023 if the measures remained unchanged, and the RFDM estimated 11.96 million pounds. So that was one piece of information that helped the monitoring committee feel really comfortable with both models in general, was that for black sea bass, they were producing very similar results. They also looked at an analysis of out of sample predictions and a retrospective analysis to look at how well both models predicted past MRIP estimates. And in making their recommendation for the RFDM, they also, referenced those analyses as part of their rationale, that the RFDM seemed to predict the past MRIP estimates reasonably well. And there was some discussion of 2016 and 2017 were specific years that the model produced lower estimates than what MRIP estimates were. And there was a discussion of, well, those estimates were previously identified as outliers. So it makes sense that the model would predict something lower, and maybe the model prediction is more reasonable than the MRIP value itself because the model is considering multiple years of data and other inputs, not just the MRIP data. The monitoring committee also was able to use the Shiny app for black sea bass during the monitoring committee meeting, and there's a screenshot of it up on the screen there, and you probably can't read all the words, but the version that they saw was for coastwide measures. And so there are sliders to say like number of days open in each wave, and then the bag limit and the minimum size. And so this was at the meeting, it was set up at the coastwide level. So they used this to come up with their estimates for the non-preferred coastwide measures. And so they were able to see how the tool actually worked because they used it in real time. And they really liked this, and they thought this would be very useful to use at the monitoring committee level. And then later down the road, when the states are developing their measures and the technical committee is considering the state measures, and the developers of this model said that they do intend to create a Shiny app like this, but where you can move the sliders for every state to see how that would result in harvest. But they looked at this version at the coastwide level during the meeting, and they thought this would be a really valuable tool. So for all of these reasons, the monitoring committee recommended using the RFDM for 2023 for black sea bass. Hannah also mentioned that for all 3 species, the monitoring committee recommended using an 80% confidence interval. And I won't go into all the details because it's the exact same rationale as what Hannah said, and it's based on a previous analysis that was done by the Harvest Control Rule, FMET, and PDT. The monitoring committee thought that was appropriate, and they also supported continued discussion of this topic next year for setting measures for 2024 and beyond, but they were fully in support of an 80% confidence interval for this go around. So these again, the models were used to go through the first step of the percent change approach process, which is to come up with your estimate of expected harvest next year if you leave this year's measures in place and the confidence interval. So this is just showing the values of the confidence interval based on the monitoring committee's recommendation. And the key take-home message is that next year's RHL is below the confidence interval, which puts us in that bottom row of the percent change approach table. It means that harvest is very likely to exceed next year's RHL if measures are left unchanged, which is basically what this slide is showing. So walking through the table, that puts us in the 10% reduction category. And the 10% reduction is applied to the estimate of 2023 harvest under 2022 measures. So based on the monitoring committee's recommendation for using the RFDM, that gives us a harvest target of 10.78 million pounds for 2023. We previously talked about accountability measures and how they've been triggered for black sea bass, and how the accountability measure language say that for stocks above their biomass target, adjustments to measures will be made, taking into account the performance of the measures and conditions that precipitated the overage. We previously talked about how we got a letter from GARFO saying that due to recent actions taken by the Council and the Commission, no additional action is needed beyond the changes required under the percent change approach to deal with these accountability measures. And the monitoring committee agreed with that, especially considering that the percent change approach was already requiring a 10% reduction. That, you know, they agreed that no additional action is needed for accountability measures. So in terms of the monitoring committee's recommendations for the specific measures to go along with the 10% reduction, again, at this stage, the council and board need to focus on the decision to waive federal waters measures or not, and then the measures that go along with that. And then the specific state waters measures will be determined later through the board process. But the monitoring committee's recommendation for the decision that needs to be made today is to continue using conservation equivalency to waive the federal waters measures in 2023. They agreed that based on the results of the RFDM, that the current non-preferred coastwide measures are too liberal because they result in harvest that's higher than the target that we would need under the 10% reduction. So they started working on recommendations for revised measures during the meeting using that Shiny app, but the modelers wanted to go back and make sure that the model was appropriately dealing with closed waves. So based on that, you know, further looking into the model and making sure it was doing things appropriately, the monitoring committee finalized their recommendation over email after the monitoring committee meeting. So their recommendation for the revised non-preferred coastwide measures is essentially increasing the minimum size by 1 inch, keeping the bag at 5 fish, and then reducing the season a bit so that the new season would be June 10th through September 10th. And again, these are the non-preferred coastwide measures that are intended to be waived in favor of state waters measures. They are not intended to be implemented. So if you look at these and you think like those would not work in my state, the intent is that if the council and board want to waive federal waters measures, that these would not actually be implemented. They're just needed as part of the process to make that happen. The monitoring committee also recommended revisions to the precautionary default measures. So their recommendations for new precautionary default measures are 16 inches, 2 fish, and June 1st through August 31st, which you're probably looking at that and thinking like, that looks horrible, but that's the point of these measures. They're supposed to be the deterrent measures that are only used for states and regions that do not follow the Commission's conservation equivalency guidelines. And then the reason that these needed to be changed was that the monitoring committee agreed that the current precautionary default measures might be too liberal considering the starting point for measures in each state in 2022 and the need to further restrict harvest in 2023. So these measures, the precautionary default measures, are supposed to be more restrictive than the measures that any state would consider implementing. So we took all that information to the advisory panel, and they had a lot to say. The biggest take-home message was that advisors were very frustrated that any sort of restriction is being considered for black sea bass, given the high availability and high abundance of the stock right now. So specifically, 6 advisors and 1 member of the public voiced strong opposition to any restrictions given the high availability. At the time, we were considering the monitoring committee's recommendations. We hadn't yet gotten this letter from Garfo saying that we had to use the recreational demand model. So at the time we presented them that the monitoring committee recommended status quo for Scup. And so 2 advisors questioned why status quo was appropriate to consider for Scup, but not black sea bass, given that they're both highly abundant. And just at face value, it didn't seem to make all that much sense. A few advisors had comments along the lines of the overages that we've seen are due to high availability. One advisor said that we're going to just keep exceeding the limits because the stock is so high. Catch cannot be effectively constrained by management measures. Advisors said things like black sea bass are hard to avoid. They're almost becoming a nuisance species in some places. Anglers are having no trouble catching the full bag limit, and anglers are constantly discarding black sea bass they can't keep. So they were concerned about, how this didn't seem to make sense with the need for further restrictions, and that concern that, given this, we would continue to have overages even with further restrictions. 5 advisors expressed concerns about negative impacts of further restrictions on the for-hire sector specifically. So advisors said things like, if we need to further restrict on black sea bass, we're going to put for-hire boats out of business because they're already having a hard time. And black sea bass is an extremely abundant species. It's one of the few species that they, know that they can catch. And given trends and regulations in other species, that this is a very important stock for them. There was some discussion of the need to do a better job of considering how the measures might impact the for-hire sector differently from the private recreational sector, and a need to do more analysis of that. And one advisor summarized data that suggested that in 2022 that the restrictions that they not only did they not appear to achieve their full intended reduction, but they seemed to more negatively impact the for-hire sector than the private recreational sector. Advisors had a lot of concerns about data broadly. So one advisor expressed concerns about the accuracy of the data and how uncertainty in the data impacts the results under the percent change approach. 3 advisors expressed concern about, we heard this earlier today with Scup, concern about data coming from the for-hire sector versus the private recreational sector, where the for-hire sector, federally permitted vessels anyway, have mandatory reporting through VTRs. And so there's concerns about how that data might be more accurate than the private recreational data from MRIP and how that's impacting the process. One advisor said that management is constantly behind what's happening on the water due to data lags. One advisor said that it's confusing that the model results suggest that the restrictions taken in 2022 don't achieve the intended reduction. And it's also confusing that we have these 2 models to begin with, and that one of the models requires switching between numbers of fish. It produces outputs in numbers of fish, and we need to convert them to weight. One advisor said that the stock assessment may not be accurately capturing increased recruitment, and that the stock might not be adequately sampled. Multiple advisors talked about the need to just make big picture changes to the management approach. So they said things like this, just everything we're doing isn't working and we need to kind of make big picture changes. One advisor said the whole process just needs to start from scratch and replace it with something new. One advisor recommended bringing in international experts to review the process, saying that, everybody who's involved in this process right now, we're essentially part of the problem, and we need to bring in people, like independent people who aren't already part of this process, to review it and help us figure out how to fix this. And this advisor also recommended that the reviewers be selected by fishermen. 3 advisors expressed support of what's been referred to as a total length limit, where there's a certain number of inches and you can keep all fish you catch up until cumulatively their length adds up to whatever the predetermined acceptable total length limit is. And then this is sometimes talked about that there would also be a prohibition on discard. So you have to keep everything that you catch up until you reach that total cumulative length, and then you stop fishing. There was some discussion of, this should be done as a way to reduce discards, or at least it should be something that's considered, maybe starting with the for-hire sector. So various levels of support for how to do that. One advisor recommended consideration of when we need changes, such as when we need a reduction, that we could spread that over multiple years to help kind of ease the impacts of that. Just waiting for the slide to move. One advisor thought that the approach, including the approach to management, including the new percent change approach, does not appropriately consider stock dynamics. So we talked about how there are the 3 biomass categories in the percent change approach, but it's not giving consideration to other things such as like the expected trajectory of the stock over time, like if it's expected to increase, decrease, or remain kind of stable. There's not different considerations for that built into the percent change approach. There was a discussion of like the percent change approach is requiring a 10% reduction for black sea bass this year, but an even bigger reduction would have been required under the old process. And advisors talked about how the goal of the harvest control rule was to provide stability in measures, but we're still looking at this 10% reduction. And one advisor said that the outcome for scup and black sea bass indicates that the percent change approach isn't considering the right starting point for measures, and that this is something to keep in mind when the council and policy board think about what is going to be the appropriate replacement for the percent change approach after the sunset period. That further consideration of this issue is needed. And one advisor said that managers need to consider how black sea bass, the high abundance, is negatively impacting other species. So other comments made by advisors. One advisor said that he had come to this advisory panel meeting planning to recommend that the current size limit stay in place, but extending the open season into January because there's still fish available then, and there's often the weather's good enough that boats can get out. But he was frustrated to learn that this wasn't even on the table because now we're looking at further restrictions. One advisor expressed the need for greater private recreational accountability to avoid negative impacts on the for-hire sector. So this is what was kind of mentioned during the Scup presentation too. The idea that most of the MRIP estimates of harvest are coming from the private recreational sector, concerns about uncertainty in that data and how that could negatively impact the for-hire sector because they're managed collectively. One advisor said that due to the black sea bass biology and because they start as females and some transition to males at older ages, that removing larger fish would not result in the same level of negative impacts as for other species where there's more concern about removing large females. And then again, just frustration that status quo was recommended by the monitoring committee for Scup, but not for black sea bass. So that's everything through the monitoring committee meeting. And then again, as we previously discussed, just last week, we got revisions to the recreational demand model. And we got the letter from Garfo saying that their stance is that we must use the recreational demand model because it's the best available science. So first off, it didn't change the outcome for black sea bass, whether you use the recreational fleet dynamics model or the most recent version of the recreational demand model, or the version of the recreational demand model that was brought forward to the monitoring committee. All of those require a 10% reduction under the percent change approach. It's just the difference is in terms of what's that 10% reduction applied to. And you can see that column there where it says estimated 2023 harvest under 2022 measures. That's the value that you would apply that 10% reduction to. So the resulting harvest target would change. And that also means that there's different considerations in terms of what specific measures would be appropriate to achieve that. But it doesn't change the fact that a 10% reduction is still needed under the percent change approach, regardless of which version of the model you're looking at. So given the recent developments and the fact that the monitoring committee recommended using the recreational fleet dynamics model, but we got the letter from Garfo stating that we have to use the recreational demand model, we needed to come up with different non-preferred coastwide measures because the monitoring committee recommendation was based on the other model. So this is a suggestion from staff for what to consider. This is, this has not been reviewed by the monitoring committee. This honestly came together yesterday afternoon because we first needed to, we used the revised RDM model results, which we just got last Monday. And first we took the monitoring committee's recommendations and we said, well, would these work? And they were too restrictive under the new revised RDM results. So then we had to think about, okay, well, what would be better? And honestly, we were not able to get to that place of figuring out what would be appropriate until yesterday afternoon. So this has not had the chance to be reviewed by anyone else. And I wanted to acknowledge Kylie and Hannah, who helped me out with this while I was busy thinking about wind yesterday. So based on the analysis that we were able to do yesterday, we think that the new non-preferred coastwide measures that would work if the decision is to use the recreational demand model would be what's in bold there, 15 inches, 5 fish in May 15th through September 8th, which is in the row A, there's the current non-preferred coastwide measure. So you can see how they compare. And again, the non-preferred coastwide measures are the measures that are written into the federal regulations, but then waived in favor of the state waters measures. And that's all I had for my part of the presentation. And then Tracy has a few slides on the Virginia proposal.
Thanks, Julia. So this is for consideration for the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass board only. As you're probably aware, this is coming to you a little earlier than usual. Usually it's a month or two after this that this proposal is before the board. And this is just due to a request from NOAA staff to help with the rulemaking. So Virginia has submitted a proposal to open their recreational black sea bass fishery for February 1st through 28th, 2023, with a minimum size limit and 15 fish bag limit. So as discussed at your previous August Council Commission meeting, the NOAA has a proposed regulatory clarification stating that vessels landing black sea bass in a state with an approved Wave 1 recreational fishery are subject to the state regulations during that Wave 1 fishery, which is what Virginia is following with these proposed measures. Virginia will use the same process for monitoring landings as they've done for past February fisheries from 2019 to 2021 to ensure accurate characterization of the 2023 February fishery. This includes any vessel fishing for black sea bass must have a permit, which comes with 2 reporting requirements. First, each vessel must hail the VMRC Marine Police Operations Station at the start of the trip to let staff coordinate meeting some vessels at the dock when they land to count the fish and obtain biological data like lengths and weights. In addition, permit holders must report to VMRC information on the trip, such as the number of black sea bass caught and released. And VMRC can use this data collected from these reporting requirements to get an estimate of total landings in pounds for their February fishery. So once the February 2023 harvest has been calculated, VMRC will submit a proposal for season adjustments to the 2023 season to account for their February harvest to the TC for review, which will then come before the board for your approval. And this proposal was brought before the monitoring committee, the technical committee, and the advisory panels, which all had no concerns about Virginia's proposal. So with that pretty brief presentation, I'm happy to take, or I guess, do we want to do questions? No? Or, okay, but yeah, so that's it for my presentation.
Debating whether or not, let me just see it around the table if anybody has any questions. I'm going to limit questions. I know we're getting into lunchtime. Are there any questions regarding the presentation? Mike Pending.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think you said that the reason we're talking about this today was based on a request from our staff, but we didn't make such a request, so I'm not sure where the
Laura Hansen, I think, is who requested it. I think that's her name originally.
Yeah, but we don't need, like, our rulemaking is done. We don't, the Virginia's approach doesn't affect our
okay,
rulemaking.
That's just what I was originally told, but I don't know.
I wouldn't worry too much about it, Tracy. Thank you. Anyone else? I have Roy Miller with his hand up online. Go ahead, Roy.
Could I request that you bring back the table of the staff deliberations from yesterday? Could I look at that again, please?
So Stephen, I think he means slide 24.
Roy, did you have a question or did you just want to see it?
I just wanted to see it, Mr. Chairman. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Anyone else at the table? Anyone else from the board? Okay, I'm not seeing any that, so what we're gonna do, I see some hands in the audience. There will be opportunity when we get back from lunch for the public to weigh in on directions that we go or provide comments as necessary. So I'd like to call our lunch break at this time. Thank you, Julia and Tracy, for your presentations. Let's go ahead and take our break, come back at 1:45. And we'll start off with a motion. I think given the discussions that we already had this morning, things are going to be set up a little more streamlined, based on Garfo's suggestions and recommendations. So enjoy lunch and we'll see you back at 1:45. Thank you.